Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. I really appreciate your time here. We're going to dive into QA and UAT, and that taking us into Go Live and what that means with AEM. I know it's going to be a very exciting presentation for most of you. It's a very exciting topic for us. So, as far as an agenda, we're just going to go through a little bit of an introduction. You know, what is QA? And then also talk a little bit about team roles and responsibilities within projects and in the software development lifecycle. Not only the consultant side of things, where us at 3Share are doing things, but also the client side. It's definitely a team operation here. We'll also get into how we actually do QA in our projects. Francisco's going to go through a little bit of a QA theory as well, and the plan, the execution, how that gets us moved on into our UAT test plan, and then diving into UAT and the importance of UAT for team identification, UAT kickoff meeting, which I feel is very important, being a project manager, something that creates a very successful UAT testing period, and then of course what is the purpose of all this for when we are actually going live. So a little bit of an introduction. Once again, my name is Pete Hoback. I'm a senior project manager at 3Share. I've been working with 3Share since 2014, and I've been a project manager since 2010, and I've done somewhere in the ballpark of 24 projects, different varying in sizes and also complexity of those particular projects.
Hello, and I'm Francisco Fagalde. I'm a QA analyst. I've been working with 3Share since 2017, but I've been testing for 10 years now. And I shared with this beautiful company around 8 projects, and it's been great so far. Yes.
So, one of the things that you see up here, we kind of, I think this meme kind of sums up a little bit about QA and the testing process and projects. This is something we want to avoid. I see you test your code in production. Well, I too like to live dangerously. I think, this is obviously something we're going to try and convince everybody here to avoid, if that's possible. I know it's easier said than done, but that's what we're going to be doing here, and that's what our purpose is. And really, what is quality assurance? And there is a difference. I'm sure a lot of you already know that there is a difference between quality assurance and quality control. Francisco's going to go into that a little bit more detail here in a little while. But another important part of QA and what we're going to be working with is going to be, our requirement analysis when we're doing our discovery in our projects. Really helps us out moving forward when we're in that software development life cycle. And then, why do we do QA with AEM? The benefits of it are actually finding bugs and issues before we get into those critical points within the project. So,
yes.
And of course, there are disadvantages to not doing QA. Testing in production being one of those disadvantages. Something we don't want to, we're going to be trying to avoid at all costs. So, getting into some team roles and responsibilities during the QA process. From a consultant side of things, one of the things that we want to make sure that we have in place in any project that we're going to be starting for it to be successful is typically we have, some type of designs or wireframes that are coming over from our clients. We want to make sure that those particular designs, wireframes, what have you, are available to us. As soon as the project starts, that's where we're going to be kicking off our requirement analysis, figuring out what those requirements are, working with the client in a symbiotic relationship, so to speak. And really, once we're getting at those requirements, it's allowing us to take a look of what our acceptance criteria is going to be. This is going to be our basis, really, of QA testing, right?
Exactly. And once we have all this information, we begin to plan the QA methodology and begin the executions in the lower environments.
So another thing that I want to point out here is we make an assumption, or we're making an assumption that the client has hired a QA analyst, whether it be from the client side of things, or taking somebody like Francisco, who is a QA analyst, and bringing them onto the project. And we'll discuss a little bit real quick about what it's like if there isn't a QA analyst on the project, and where those roles and responsibilities fall to. So, and then from the client side of things, once again, like I mentioned, there is going to be that design review, but one of the key points here is working together with us, the consultants at 3Share, working together with our clients during QA, and going over all of our specific requirements that are necessary for a successful project. Really diving into that acceptance criteria, because that's going to help us through this QA process. And then there's also the responsibility on the client side. I know as a project manager, I've been on projects, and this kind of, goes back to the original meme of testing, when we get to production, the critical parts of a project is there's going to have to be some QA testing on the client side of things as well. It just doesn't fall solely on the QA analyst, and that provides, go ahead.
Yeah, the feedback is important during this phase. We provide you the test cases, the steps to follow to test all these functionalities, and of course, we also need the feedback to check that everything is okay and the requirements are met.
So what does it mean if we don't have a QA analyst on projects? Well, I mean, I'm sure you guys all can guess. A lot of these roles and responsibilities then do fall onto the client, and sometimes we've been in projects where the clients actually want that. They would prefer to do all their QA on their side of things, and then it just takes follow up on the consultant side to make sure that we're moving forward in the right direction.
Exactly.
So. Anything else?
Yes, I can take it here.
Yep. So that takes us to getting into a little bit of our QA projects, and get into a little bit of theory. So Francisco?
Yes. So QA theory. Fun, huh? I'll try to make it fun. Some of you may know this one, actually. A tester goes into a bar, orders one beer, orders 395 beers, orders -1 beer, orders a lizard, and then orders a ruff. Then the first real customer comes in and asks, "Where's the bathroom?" And the bar bursts into flames. So you gotta test everything, right? QA is important. So, as you're aware, there must be a whole testing phase during the development and before the release, because no one wants to see a bug in the final product, right? I mean, let's put a fresh example here. Who loves Game of Thrones?
I know I do.
Or loved?
Right.
I sure did. I mean, I have been a fan for almost a decade and was so excited to see how it all ended. This was a show that I would enjoy at the end of every week, would lose myself into a different world for a while, and then allow me to start fresh on Monday. But when this happened, the immersion broke. I went back to the real world. I thought I'm finding errors on weekend, and I started wondering, how can something like this happen? I mean, didn't they have like a monstrous budget for maybe QA, right? So a typical testing practice must cover 3 main items, which are this: functionality, look and feel, and performance, and the multi-platform checks. For functionality, it's the expected functionality of a component to behave exactly like it is supposed to, which means that these components on the site are doing what the client needs and meets the requirements. Then look and feel and performance, the component is properly displayed according to the original design, while performance is not affected. This is pretty self-explanatory. This is useful to check for visual errors, how everything is displayed, and to make sure it works smoothly enough. Then you have the multi-platform checks. All the desktop and browsers behave and look the same. This also applies for mobile versions and different devices. It doesn't matter if you're connecting from iOS or Android, you should see the same product. Moving on, if we have a company or brand, we need to ensure quality. Most of the time, a website is the first impression that a potential client has on the product. Let's say you want to sell insurance, for example. Your homepage is explaining in a perfectly designed paragraph why this product is the best choice for you, and you develop all this idea using sentences like there's attention to detail, for example, but there's a typo in it. Sure, an error can always happen, but it should not become a habit. That's a plastic water bottle right there. This is when a business starts to lose credibility. Of course, these are just visual examples, simple ones. It could be even more catastrophic if the functionality is affected, or even the entire site is not behaving like expected. So how do we prevent something like that from happening? In order to have a good testing phase in our projects, we need to understand the difference between QA and QC. Quality assurance aims to prevent defects with a focus on the process used to make a product. This is a proactive quality process. Quality control aims to identify and correct defects in the finished product. Quality control, therefore, is a reactive process. In other words, anyone can do quality control with the proper directions. But in order to have effective directions, you need a QA analyst to design those test cases and scenarios during the development, for then the user acceptance testing or future testers execute them and validate all the functionalities. And talking about designing good test cases, this leads me to something that I always like to bring up, the pesticide paradox, or insecticide paradox. This is all about keeping your tests relevant. Almost 20 years ago, Boris Weiser stated what became known as the pesticide paradox. Every method you use to prevent or find bugs leaves a residue of subtler bugs against which those methods are ineffectual. Imagine, for example, that you have a farm, like in the picture, but it has a plague problem, insects. So this is the work of your life, and you need these bugs eradicated. What you will normally do is use a pesticide with an effective formula. And this formula could work perfectly for maybe the first, the second, the third, even the fourth time. But eventually, some of these bugs are going to develop immunity to the formula. And if you keep using it without any modification whatsoever, some insects are going to stay hidden. They will reproduce and continue to affect your work without you knowing about it. So this metaphor applies very well to testing in projects. A good QA analyst designs test cases without forcing any specific data sets, unless necessary, of course, in the testing steps, so that the future person using these test cases will have to choose their own data set, thus increasing the chances of finding hidden bugs or isolated issues. Of course, there's also a way to keep your tests relevant, which is every sprint keep adding to your tests every functionality that has been worked on. So you have a proper and effective regression test for the final phase. Not long ago, this is an example, I had this project where I had to test a search box functionality. And for technical reasons, it was not possible to migrate all the results for each keyword. So I tested many of them, found and corrected bugs, but I did not include those keywords in the test cases steps. So this was for the future tester or user acceptance testing phase, whatever, they will not use the same keywords as I did. I'm forcing them to choose their own. So this will allow, this will increase the chances to find hidden problems with every search that they do. This is a pretty simple example of how this works. With the Pesticide Paradox, there are other examples like a login functionality, for example. You don't force unless necessary. You don't force a username and password. You let the future testers to pick one of those, because if there's an isolated problem with a certain user, you can find it like that. Here's a graphic of this applied during development. You can see actually on the first generation, before the first formula of the pesticide implementation, there's a lot of different type of bugs. And after the pesticide implementation, you have killed a lot of them. But then in later generations, they have reproduced, and if you use the same formula again, the bugs are going to stay hidden and you're not going to notice it. You're going to keep using the same tests and the bugs are going to be still there. So to summarize, ideally, it is important to try to find and fix errors during the development process on QA and get ready for QC with effective test scenarios ready for future validations, since most of the time UAT is too late, right? So I will leave you with Peter. He will talk to you about QA planning from a project manager side.
So that was pretty informative from the short time that we have going over QA. So this takes us to a point of, how do we plan for QA within our projects? And within the software development life cycle, we have, of course, there's the consultant responsibilities and client responsibilities, which we talked about, but there's also some methodology that we have to discuss on how we're going to actually be going about our software development life cycle. And a lot of times the word agile comes to mind, right? And, we keep using that word, but do we really know, do we really think it means what we think it means? A lot of times I think not. That's why we bring in more of an agile waterfall hybrid type of methodology. And the reason for this is because we're all working within, budgetary constraints and, of course, timeline constraints to get to our end goal of doing our, go live for whether it be a sites project within AEM or a dam project within AEM. So in breaking this down, obviously we're using some agile principles and having our Scrum meetings, and then we're breaking down the work into various sprints, however many sprints that may be. They may be in 2-week time periods. But really what we're trying to do when we're bringing QA and getting QA involved is they're going to be there during that whole discovery process when we're doing our requirements gathering. when we're going through sprint number 1, they're going to be sitting kind of in the back seat, finalizing their plan. They may be starting to test, but really that testing starts at sprint 2. And then on the client side of things, what we will try and do is we want to try and bring in the client on sprint 3 when more pieces of the puzzle have come together. There's more of a big picture overview of what it is we're working towards, and then we can start receiving that feedback from the client, right?
Yes, and actually here we can see a perfect example of difference between QA and QC. Most of the time during development, a tester will be testing separately both the back end and front end of a piece of component or functionality, and later during UAT they're going to test the whole product merged. So that will be quality control.
Yeah, and really in the whole process, you know, there's a lot of communication that has to go on, and really the relationship between the QA analyst and the developer, even the technical architect for that fact of the matter, is communication. It really is key during this whole process, and that the whole team is working together and communicating effectively. You know, because during that time period, the QA analyst is creating test cases and test scenarios while also doing development and then giving feedback, not only from the client side, but giving feedback from the devs as well as what they're finding. This, during this whole process also, the QA analyst is developing test cases, UAT test plan and UAT test cases and scenarios for when we're jumping into UAT. Which we'll discuss here in a minute. But I just wanted to give, you know, just a real basic example of what that looks like in any given sprint, and really the need for that communication. You know, I think we've all seen, you know, Scrum Boards before and what they mean. I've been in projects where, you know, there haven't been necessarily as many swim lanes or columns, and it causes it causes a little bit of confusion. But what we want to do here is really make sure that things are spelled out so there isn't any confusion in this process. A developer will bring a ticket or a user story into in progress. Then they will communicate to the technical architect that it's ready for build. Technical architect will merge that code and then, you know, deploy that code to whatever environment, lower environment that the QA analyst is going to test. And then that's going to be put into our, you know, our deployed to dev or QA for that QA analyst to take it and go from there. And it's very succinct, and you know, it will not cause confusion is the main point here of that I'm trying to convey. So definitely have been in projects where that has not been the case and there has been confusion. What's going on? What's happening? During our software development life cycle, and what we want to do is try and spell it out as best as possible, because we do have multiple personalities, multiple people involved in projects.
Yes. So let's continue here. We have,
So that just takes us into user acceptance testing, and it's something that now we're getting into that more reactionary period that Francisco was talking about as far as testing is concerned. The difference between QA being proactive in our software development lifecycle and now into user acceptance testing. So anything to add to that?
Yes, so this phase is really important because it's actually the final filter before going live. So this is the moment to announce any feedback, any important change request even. Let the developers know what are the fixes needed and have enough time to revalidate those fixes to the applied functionalities.
Yeah, and I can't really emphasize enough the importance of QA while the development process is going on and moving forward, because what we want to do is proactively find those issues before we even get to this point, you know, because then we're going to be bringing in a team of individuals, a UAT team, where there's a selection process, and we want to be able to avoid as many of the bumps and bruises that we're going to find in UAT as possible. So But that does bring us to an important step, and that's the UAT team selection. It's something in projects that I like to work with the client on in selecting the team probably about halfway through the, or at least to begin talking about it halfway through the, our sprints and software development. There's some skill sets that the UAT team is going to have. They're going to have basic working knowledge of AEM. I think that kind of goes without saying, and they're going to have to be able to read and write because they're going to have to read test cases and be able to do some typing because there will be bugs found. And then another important step for UAT, I've actually been in projects where we have not had a UAT kickoff and learned a quick lesson there that how important UAT kickoffs are. It really brings the full team together. We'll have, the developers and also the QA analyst, the technical architect on the same meeting with the UAT team to be able to answer questions that the team may have for the actual developers or the individual that wrote the test cases. It's extremely important to have this UAT kickoff call. It really sets us up for a successful UAT period, and we're not running into any blockers during that time period. So, and then it goes into the next thing with test case execution, and then of course we get into bug reporting. So, yes. Typically we have 5 different severities, and go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is really important to try to assign these severities correctly. So when talking about QA towards AEM, we can say that trivial bugs are for visual errors, visual issues, typos, anything like that. And then a minor error would be a slight section of the component or the functionality not working, like a button, for example, in a whole set of CTAs. And then a major bug will be the complete component not working as intended or not meeting the requirements or respecting the acceptance criteria. This starts to be a high priority for fixing. Then you have a critical bug. This is not only affecting the functionality of the user story in scope, but it's also affecting other components, other sections of the page. So this is highest priority. And then you have a blocker. This is not a problem itself, it's not a defect, but it's blocking us to actually get to the place where we can validate this functionality. It could be a server down, problems with the credentials. So if we need to check this part of the functionality and we cannot get there yet, we still need to document that as a blocker so they can unblock that and we can then provide the results. Yes.
Yeah, and of course, we want to have the, testers that they're going to be giving the developers the steps to reproduce that particular bug, and then also what's helpful is screenshots or videos, GIFs, as you had mentioned earlier. Yes. But I mean, where does this all take us? I mean, it takes us to a point of go live, and the whole purpose of what we're talking about here for QA, UAT really is in go live preparation. It's really to give us, a level of confidence when we're going to go live of 100%. We're 100% confident, or at least as close to it as we can be when we're going live, because really the reality is, we want to avoid any last minute changes. I think, there's probably a lot of us in this room that have gone through situations like that, and it's not fun. It's long hours, and, it's things that you think in the back of your head, you know what, we could have taken care of this earlier in the project if we would just taken that extra 5 minutes or extra hour of time to address it. And really, what you're trying to do as well is provide, a trusted and standardized process to make this repeatable so you can do it over and over again. It becomes secondhand nature. I know a lot of times within projects, QA and testing kind of can fall by the wayside because of costs and whatnot, but in reality, the upfront costs will cause there to be less down the road costs with mistakes and bugs. And really, the last thing you want is for an end user to be finding out issues with your site or, the digital asset manager and coming back to you and saying, hey, guess what? We just found this huge portion of your site that doesn't work. And, oh, how did we miss it? How could, and that's, I think that's something where, what we're trying to do is convince the importance of QA and how it can help out in the end.
Yeah, I am. Basically, long story short, the reason when we talk about confidence is you are actually feeling good about the idea that you had a person or a group of persons 100% focused on testing these user stories on dev environment, then on QA, then on stage, UAT. You went through all those levels of checks and filters. So when you finally make it to production and you go live, you know that this has been tested several times and checked. So confidence.
Confidence, yeah.